It didn't take long. I think we did this for a couple of months, and I said, that is it.
And you did leave?
I did, and ran off with another man. Went straight into an adulterous relationship. So I just leveled down. I really believed God sent this guy to me. I really believed it with all my heart, that God sent this guy into my life to get me away from Steve and give me my happily ever after, because that was my goal in life. That, though, was a real turning point for Steve and I both, because at the same time, independent of each other, because we were hundreds of miles away from each other at this point, I had gone to Sacramento and filed for divorce. And that's how I ran into this other guy. The Lord was dealing with both of us. I knew what I was doing was wrong, even though I was finally, for the first time in 2 years, enjoying myself. I was with somebody that cared about me. He was gentle, he was kind, he was blah, blah, blah.
The opposite.
Opposite in every way. There couldn't be more opposite. And it was wonderful. And I really convinced myself he was sent to me by God. Well, but I'm disturbed inside. Inside, I am disturbed, but I'm ignoring it. And I'm not using the drugs. I'm not doing any of that stuff. I'm free of all that now. At the same time, Steve's still in LA doing his cop thing, and what I didn't know was God was disturbing him big time. I mean, really raking him over the coals, and he had a just tremendous, tremendous experience with God. And I am going through my own upheaval. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't, there was no answers for me. I didn't have any answers for what I was going through. And so I had to call Steve. I can't remember what the reason was for the phone call, but I had to put in a call to him. He didn't know I was with anybody else. He had no idea. I didn't want him to know. He was a maniac, and I didn't know what he would do if he found out, so I didn't tell him anything. But we had this conversation, and he basically was kind of coercing me to come back to him. And I told him, I said, there's no way I'm coming back. I can't. And he said, Kathy, just call your mom and dad and just talk to them. And, you know, just have a conversation with them. And I agreed to do that because my mom and dad I finally told them everything. I wasn't telling them anything. And I finally told them everything. And my dad was the kind of man, he has never even noticed another woman in his life, let alone hear that I'm going through this. And, you know, there was no way mom and dad would ever encourage this marriage. So I called him up. I was in a phone booth, and I called him up, and my dad answered the phone. And so I'm starting to share with him what's been going on. And I didn't get the whole sentence out of my mouth. Dad stopped me and he said, Kathy, your mother and I have been praying for you, and God has spoken to us and told us you need to be at home with your husband. And man, the bottom dropped out again. I literally slumped down in that phone booth, fell to the floor in that phone booth, just devastated, because it was my dad's voice, but it was the Lord speaking to me. Yeah, a million things were going through my mind, and then my mom got on the phone. She said the same thing, and my sister, my oldest sister who was walking with the Lord, she said, and it's like I just felt so ganged up on and so confused, but I knew it was the Lord. I'm hearing my family say words to me, but it was the Spirit of God that revealed to me the resurrected Christ. That same God was telling me now, go back. And I'm in this phone booth and I'm going through this like, wow. I had an option. I had two options: to continue with this man, this virtual stranger, basically, that I had ran off with, who was a prince,
Yeah.
or go back to devastation. That was my only
Yeah.
point of reference for this whole marriage.
Almost choosing the nightmare over the fairy tale.
That was exactly what it was. I did. I said, okay. I don't know how I'm going to do this, Lord, but I'm going to do it. And I'm doing it for you, Jesus, because I really believe this is you calling me. And I did. I went back. And wow, man, was it ever hard. It was the hardest thing. One of the hardest things. In that short 2.5-year period, that was probably the most difficult thing I did, was to go back to Steve, because the feelings were gone.
Yeah.
There was no love, zero respect. I was minus respect for him. There was nothing in me, naturally speaking, that wanted to be with him. But I knew I was called to go, and I went. And for 4 months, 4 long months, all I wanted was to be with this other guy. That's all I wanted. It's all I thought about. Cried constantly. But somehow I was able to hide all that from Steve. And I was going along. Steve fell in love with me. He finally fell in love with me. He got radically saved.
So he had genuinely changed.
Oh yeah, he was a different guy. I mean, he wasn't Prince Charming. He was still Steve Gallagher.
Yeah, yeah.
But he was a saved, repentant Steve Gallagher. And there was a love in him for Jesus that just rocked me. And that was pretty much what kept me hanging in there. But I had to hide my tears for months, because even though I saw what had happened to him and the change, the conversion was very real, I still had no feelings for this guy. I had no respect for him. He would touch me, he'd put his arm around me or try to kiss me, and just my skin would crawl. I didn't want him, but I stayed, and I hid my feelings. He never knew what I felt like, what I was going through. And but after about 4 months, something started to change in me. The feeling of love started to come back. The respect, I think the respect was coming back. I would see him just weep over sinful attitudes, or the struggle with pornography was so intense for him. Man, it was intense. And if he fell, he would just cry. He never cried before. He never cared before.
Yeah.
It was he worshiped this stuff.
Yeah.
So now I'm seeing this different guy, and this hunger for God, and this repentant spirit that was so, it was just amazing to me.
Yeah.
So I'm like, everything's turning around for me inside toward him. And I'm like, not only was respect restored, there was something so totally different in my heart toward him. It's like, that is a man I could follow. And even though Steve continued to struggle for a couple of years, he did. It was not easy coming out of pornography. It just wasn't. He was so terribly addicted to the stuff. And it was such a part of him, because he just gave himself to it completely for years, a decade and a half, 15 years he was basically given over to it completely. So walking away from it wasn't a cakewalk at all. And we together battled our way out of it. And something else that God did in me during that time was just, I wanted him to make it. It wasn't necessarily so much the marriage right then. It just became more about this man, this guy.
Yeah, genuine self-sacrificing love for him.
If it was that, it was because of the presence of Jesus in my life, because naturally speaking, I'm very selfish. I would have wanted the perfect marriage. I wanted in myself the fairy tale.
Yeah.
But I do believe that Jesus came into my weakness and gave me something I didn't have naturally speaking, and that was, I want this guy to make it. I want him to make it. I want to forgive him. I want him to have everything God has for him, and that's not natural.
Yeah.
So I have to give God the credit and the glory for it. The first couple of years were absolutely brutal, coming out of this addiction together. And I see it just as much as a part of my life as it was his life. Not the sexual sin, I was never addicted to it, but just being one with him.
Yeah.
It was mine. That's just like, that's the way the covenant is, you know, whatever, we're in each other. We are one with one another. And I was going through it with him, and I felt very much a part of it. And it was mine as much as it was his. And there were times when he would confess to me he got into pornography in one way or another. And usually it was because the enemy set him up. He never went looking for it after that. He didn't go pursuing it, but it was readily available. Even back then, he'd be out on a prayer walk somewhere, and he'd run across it, just a centerfold right there in front of him, you know. And then, you know, the crash and the burn. So going through that stuff together was hard. It hurt me. I still struggled with feelings of rejection and betrayal, and it's like, what's wrong with me, and all that stuff. But as I matured spiritually, and that was the game changer for both of us, really the bottom line was our walk with God. We were growing spiritually, independent of each other. I had my own walk with God that wasn't hanging on Steve Gallagher's every move. I wasn't living or dying based on what he was doing. I was walking with Christ, he was walking with Christ, and we were walking with Christ together, you know. And so his failures didn't feel fatal to me. They did to him. You know, he'd fall and he would just be so devastated. I didn't necessarily feel that way. I think I always believed he's going to make it. We're going to do this thing. And then he got stronger. He smoked me spiritually. I mean, his hunger for God, his love of the Word of God, the intensity of his personality that was such a negative bummer back in the days before he came to Christ. Now we're in the hands of God, and we're channeled for just tremendous things. I mean, God has really used him, you know, not just for his own life, but for the lives of a lot of people. So what Satan meant for evil, God definitely intended for good, and has brought so much good out of the devastation. And I think that was an early lesson for me. I don't know how did God do any of this? I'll never know. But I knew that he was going to bring much good from all of this. I wasn't thinking worldwide. I wasn't thinking globally at all. I was just thinking that nothing is wasted with the Lord. He uses everything, and he has used it all. So 40 years we've been journeying together, and I love that man. I really love him.
"5 years into your job at Progressive, bombshell. What made you willing to make such a crazy decision?"
The change in him was tremendous. The change in both of us. I knew it was the Lord, and I was excited. I wanted to go. I thought it was absolutely the right thing to do.